Welcome to ZoomInData. Hello everyone. Thank you for joining the 24th video in our extended Azure Logic Apps series. In this session, titled Azure Logic Apps plus Azure Functions, when and how to combine, we will cover when it makes sense to call Azure Functions from Logic Apps, and vice versa, step-by-step patterns for integrating the two services, HTTP, connector, custom code, durable orchestration, best practices for performance, security, error handling, cost, and maintainability. Real-world use cases and decision framework, 2026 edition, combining Logic Apps, orchestration plus low code, with functions, custom code plus compute, is one of the most powerful patterns in Azure, used by thousands of enterprises. If you find this content valuable, please subscribe to ZoomInData and enable notifications to stay updated. Let us begin. Why combine Azure Logic Apps with Azure Functions instead of doing everything in one service? Logic Apps excels at orchestration, connectors, visual designer, monitoring, and low-code workflows. Azure Functions excels at custom code, long-running tasks, complex logic, package dependencies, and compute-intensive operations. Together, Logic Apps handles flow plus integration, delegates heavy, complex work to functions, gets result back. What are the main ways to call Azure Functions from Logic Apps? Azure Functions Connector, Managed Connector, Simplest, built-in authentication. HTTP action, full control over request, headers, body, auth. Inline code action, for very small JavaScript, C# snippets, limited runtime. Custom connector, when you want reusable trigger, action interface to functions. When should you call a function from Logic Apps instead of writing logic in the workflow? Complex calculations, parsing, or algorithms not easily done with built-in actions. Need external libraries, NuGet, npm, or custom.NET/Python/Node.js code. Long-running or CPU, memory-intensive tasks, example, image processing, ML scoring. Reusable logic needed across multiple workflows or services. How do you add the Azure Functions connector in Logic Apps? In Designer right-pointing arrow search, Azure Functions, right-pointing arrow select action choose an Azure function. Authenticate with Azure Add, managed identity recommended. Pick subscription, function app, and specific function. Pass parameters. Function must have HTTP trigger, anonymous or function key auth. What authentication options exist when calling functions from Logic Apps? Managed identity, system, user assigned, recommended, no secrets. Function key, pass via header, X functions key, store in key vault. Azure AD, secure with Entra ID app registration and roles. Anonymous, only for public, internal trusted scenarios, rare. How do you call a function synchronously and get the result back in Logic Apps? Use Azure Functions Connector or HTTP action with post to function URL. Function returns JSON. Pass JSON action to use output in next steps. Set timeout appropriately. Default 120s in consumption, configurable in standard. What is the difference between calling functions versus using inline code action? Inline code, small scripts, JavaScript, C#, PowerShell, no external packages, limited runtime, 120s. Functions, full app, NuGet, npm, PyPI packages, longer execution, scalable, versioned, testable. Use inline for quick helpers. Functions for anything reusable or complex. How do you trigger a Logic Apps workflow from an Azure function? Expose Logic Apps via HTTP request trigger. Get post URL. In function, use HTTP client to post payload to Logic Apps URL. Secure with SAS key in URL or Entra ID validation in Logic Apps. Describe a common pattern. Logic Apps. Functions. External API. Logic Apps receives event, e.g., blob created. Calls function with file reference or payload. Function does heavy processing, image resize, OCR, ML inference, using libraries. How do you handle errors when calling functions from Logic Apps? Function returns HTTP 4xx, 5xx. Logic Apps action fails. Use run after equals failed for fallback. Add retry policy on functions connector, action for transient errors. Function should return meaningful error JSON. Pass in Logic Apps. What is the cost comparison when using functions inside Logic Apps workflows? Consumption Logic Apps. Each function's call equals action execution plus function's consumption cost. Standard Logic Apps. Functions call equals connector action, build, plus functions cost. Functions premium, consumption, build separately per execution plus GBS. How do you secure the function endpoint called by Logic Apps? Use managed identity, grant function app, contributor, or custom role on Logic Apps resource. Use function keys plus key vault reference, rotate regularly. Restrict function access via IP filtering, VNet integration, or private endpoints. What are best practices for performance when calling functions? Use premium, elastic functions plan for always ready instances, avoid cold starts. Keep payloads small, parse references, blob URL, instead of large data. Set appropriate timeout in Logic Apps action, default 120s. How do you pass large data between Logic Apps and functions? Upload large payload to blob storage. Pass blob URL, SAS token to function. Function reads from blob, processes, writes result back to blob or returns reference. Avoid passing greater than few MB directly in HTTP body. Describe a real-world use case combining both services. Order processing. Logic Apps receives Shopify webhook. Calls function to validate credit card. Custom fraud library. Logic Apps continues with inventory check and notifications. Image processing. Blob created event. Logic Apps triggers. Calls function for OCR, resizing. Logic Apps stores result and updates Dataverse. How do you debug functions called from Logic Apps? Logic Apps run history shows HTTP response and status code. Function app application insights. Trace request ID from Logic Apps. Local VS Code debugging for functions. Reproduce with same payload. What monitoring setup is recommended for combined workflows? Logic Apps. Azure Monitor plus Log Analytics for workflow runs. Functions. Application insights for execution, exceptions, dependencies. Correlate using custom dimension. Correlation ID passed from Logic Apps to function. How do you version functions without breaking Logic Apps callers? Use function slots, production plus staging, for zero downtime deployment. Keep endpoint URL stable. Route internally to new version. Use API versioning in function root prefix. Example, v2, process order. What are common anti-patterns to avoid? Calling functions synchronously for long-running tasks, UI, timeout issues. Passing large payloads directly, HTTP failure or high cost. No error handling, partial failures without compensation. How do you handle long-running tasks that exceed Logic Apps timeout? Logic Apps calls function asynchronously, fire and forget. Function uses durable functions for orchestration. Calls back to Logic Apps via webhook when done. Alternative. Logic Apps polls status via durable entity. How has the integration improved in 2025-2026? Native Managed Identity Support for Functions Connector, no keys. Better cold start handling in Functions Premium for real-time workflows. Enhanced tracing correlation between Logic Apps and functions via Application Insights. Why is this combination frequently asked in interviews? Interviewers want to see understanding of low-code versus pro-code balance. Common question: when would you offload logic from Logic Apps to functions? Tests knowledge of performance, cost, security, and maintainability trade-offs. What final recommendation would you give when combining both? Use Logic Apps for orchestration, connectors, monitoring, and visual design. Use functions for custom code, compute-heavy tasks, package dependencies. Keep payloads small, use references, and always make calls idempotent. Monitor both services together with Application Insights. Thank you for watching this detailed session on combining Azure Logic Apps with Azure Functions. If you found this video helpful, please like, share, and subscribe to ZoomInData. More advanced Azure Logic Apps content is coming soon. Stay connected and keep learning. See you in the next video.